Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And a warm welcome to the afternoon show. I'm Bill Arnold, and as a beautiful a day as it is here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, I know there's a lot of people concerned about the climate change around the world, and one of the best resources I have to discuss that is Dr. Cal Beisner. He's the founder and president of the Cornwall Alliance, and that is a network of evangelical Christian scholars. They're really smart men and women. They're mostly natural scientists, economists, policy experts, and theologians, philosophers, and leaders. And we're going to spend the whole hour. If you have a question about the climate change and everything that goes on, you can send it over because I'd love to get your questions. 877-933-2484. Cal, welcome to the show. All right. I think you might be muted because I can't hear you quite yet. There you are. Awesome.
I had the wrong speakers chosen.
No worries. Welcome to technology and welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. So glad
to be with you again.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to have you on, and I'm opening up the show to let people chime in with questions, of which there are many. I know I have a bunch myself.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I was just thinking, when I open up the news and if I read 10 climate change news headlines, how many of those will be solid reporting with objective facts, and how many will just lean towards fear-mongering?
Well, let's see. Probably about maybe 5% would be reasonably filled with objective facts, and about 95% would be fear-mongering.
Wow.
That's my guess.
Yeah.
But I mean, seriously, the media have been basically taken over. In fact, about I'm trying to remember how long ago it was. It seems to me it was about 8 or 9 years ago. One of the larger climate activist organizations basically paid the Associated Press, AP, which is the source of news articles used by newspapers and magazines all over the world, but especially here in the United States, paid them to become basically a conduit for articles on climate change that have the alarmist perspective. And so that now just thoroughly dominates.
Mm-hmm. I already have a question. What, Cal, would you consider the legitimate resources to read about climate change, besides your books?
Well, why should I say anything but those? Yeah. Well, there are a number of really very good sources. I would point to several different organizations in Great Britain, but available online from here is an organization called the Global Warming Policy Foundation. They publish some really excellent materials, some short articles, some much longer articles, and then some book-length papers and research items. The Heartland Institute out of Chicago does some very good work in this field. The CO2 Coalition, good friends of ours, as are the folks at Heartland. The CO2 Coalition is excellent. They publish a number of books. They publish articles on their website. They have opinion pieces published in a variety of different venues on the web quite frequently. And of course, then there's the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation at cornwallalliance.org, which is the think tank that I lead. But basically, you have to hunt around and learn to be very discerning in how you read these things. One of the key things is to recognize the difference between simulations or models and actual real-world observations. because the real world observations of global average temperature run well behind, well lower than the output of the vast majority of computer climate models. And this is why we have a whole chapter in our book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism, by the late Dr. Patrick Michaels, and then supplemented by the current wonderful Professor John Christie, on why climate modeling diverges so far from the actual observed world. So that's one of the things that you need to do. Another thing is to just notice the difference between forecasting or prediction and, again, the real world. We see an awful lot of news that says, yeah, this is going to happen. This is coming down the pike. And often it will use the language, this may be, this could be, etc. But remember, maybe or could be also means may not be, could turn out otherwise, right? And so that's kind of a cover your rear way of saying, well, this is what I think is going to happen, but I don't want to be precise about it. I don't want to be held accountable for it.
Cal, I was thinking about that driving into work today. I'm bugged by the word may, because every time you see somebody on television talk about, a drug or something, this may lower blood pressure. This may give you new energy. Only in salvation does it say it will give you eternal life. It will forgive you of your sins.
Yep, the scriptures, the word of God, that's what's solid, that's the rock, and everything else we question. That's what the Apostle Paul taught us to do in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. He says, test all things, hold fast what is good. And we as Christians really need to do that. Just yesterday, in fact, last night, I spoke for the student chapter of the American Chemical Society at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. And my whole talk basically was about the failure of so much science publishing to live up to high standards of evidence. I started off by making reference to a 2010 article in Science magazine, which is really one of the world's two most prestigious scientific journals. Back in 2010, it published a paper called A Bacterium That Can Grow by Using Arsenic Instead of Phosphorus. That paper made enormous headlines all over the place. It was downloaded 31,000 times. And by the way, the average peer-reviewed paper gets downloaded maybe 100 to 500 times. And it's been cited 348 times, and what's average is about 10 or 20. Okay, so this is a really major paper. Well, it turns out that paper has been proved to be false, completely false. And yet, it hasn't been retracted. It's still on Science Magazine's website, and there's no notice there of the fact that it's been proved false, although science itself elsewhere in a different page acknowledged this. And so people who are doing research, when they get to that article, they'll never know that that's what happened. And this is one illustration among many of the fact that the whole process of what's called peer review, which is supposed to, try to minimize the number of scientific articles that get published that are not really sound, the whole peer review process has become almost completely ineffective. In fact, one major article on it a number of years back said if peer review were a drug, it would never get on the market. Indeed, more than half the time, peer-reviewed articles turn out to be wrong.
Doesn't that make your head itch?
Yeah.
That would make me crazy. Yeah. All right. Dr. Cal Beisner is my guest. You can learn more about him at the cornwallalliance.org. I've got a question. This is kind of a big one, but would you explain how the green agenda and their objectives, how it hurts economic growth around the world.
Oh, yeah. Well, um, let's start this way. The green movement really is rooted in the thinking of the late 18th, early 19th century, uh, sad to say, pastor, but also sort of self-taught economist, Thomas Robert Malthus. In 1798, Malthus published a book called An Essay on Population. And among other things in that, the real high point of it, the big lesson that people took away from it is that human population grows exponentially. That's, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, et cetera, right? But crop production, food production, grows only arithmetically, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, et cetera, right? So obviously, if that's so, population is going to outstrip food production really rapidly. And then you're going to see population collapse due to one of three causes, either famine or disease or warfare. Now, Malthus, a pastor, didn't like the idea of famine, disease, or welfare. And so he thought, okay, so people need to learn to control their birth rates so that we stop population growth and stay where we are. Now, he was subjected to very, very strong criticism back at the time. John Stuart Mill, for instance, in a review of that book, pointed out that Malthus was forgetting that human creativity can result in food production rising faster than population, which in fact it had been doing in Britain for decades prior to Malthus's book. Malthus actually changed his view on that in the second edition of the Essay on Population. The problem is, most of Malthus's followers never heard that. And over the century and a half following then, leading up to the mid-1900s, you had all these Malthusians who just still believed, well, population is necessarily going to outstrip resources, so we need to control population. Now that got combined with the growing ecology movement of the late 19th, early 20th century, which said, well, okay, if we're managing still to feed these people, it's only because we're decimating the planet to do so. We're using up all the resources, we're using up all the farmland, we're taking all the nutrients out of the soil and so on. This was a plausible idea, but again, we have to go back, if we're going to do good science, we have to go back to empirical observation. And what was not noticed was that we actually make more resources than we consume. Resources are not natural. And we can actually improve farmland by putting more nutrients into it, for example, through nitrous fertilizers made largely from natural gas. And so what we've actually seen is that food production has continued to outstrip population growth by a very large margin. And all of the different resources that we extract from the earth, whether mineral or vegetable or animal, all of the different resources we extract from the earth have been getting more abundant, not less abundant over time, which is something that can be proved by their price trends. Price is a measure of scarcity. As scarcity rises, price rises, but as scarcity falls, price falls. Well, the prices of all the resources we extract from the earth long term are downward adjusted for inflation and especially adjusted for wages. So the Green Movement combined Malthus's mistake with the ecologists' mistake of thinking that nature is best untouched by human hands, and when we get into it, we ruin it. And as a result, it endorses all kinds of policies that prevent our using the resources that we can use from the earth. And that's what constrains economic development and constrains human flourishing.
Okay, that's such a big topic. I want to take a short break and come back and keep on this, if you don't mind, Cal. Dr. Cal Beisner is my guest. If you have a question or comment about our topic today, which is the climate change and all the issues involved with climate change, you can text your question over to 877-933-2484. We'll be right back.
I believe in the goodness of God more now than I ever have, and I have been through a lot that begged me to go in the opposite direction with my beliefs.
Lisa Turkhurst shares that even in times of uncertainty and pain, you can trust God. She writes in her new book, I Want to Trust You, But I Don't, that God is good, He's faithful and true. Enter for your chance to win one of 50 copies of Lisa Turkhurst's new book now at myfaithradio.com.
You know, I don't mess around. I went right to the top. I went to the president and founder, Dr. E. Calvin Beisner. The Cornwall Alliance seeks to enhance the fruitfulness, beauty, and safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. All right, Cal, I want to keep probing this idea of the green energy agenda. It seems to me fossil fuels are involved for all 8 billion people on this planet.
Yeah. That's definitely the case. In fact, in an article that I published fairly recently, I ran down the real details on this. The climate alarmist movement is demanding that we reach what they're calling net zero carbon dioxide emissions. That is, we would have to remove from the atmosphere as much carbon dioxide as we put into it every year in order to be at net zero. They say we need to do this in order to prevent catastrophic global warming. Now, first off, what's ironic about that is that even the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that if we did nothing to slow global warming, if we just let her rip, go ahead and use all the fossil fuels we want to use and everything else, the warming through the rest of this century would reduce gross world product, total value of everything we produce around the world each year. By the end of the 21st century, it would reduce it by 2.6%. But that would be 2.6% not of today's gross world product, but of 2100's. Well, what's going to happen between now and then? The most consistent estimates are we're going to average about 3% per year growth in gross world product. Bring it all down to the end. The average person in the world will be slightly under 9 times as wealthy, or will be having income slightly under 9 times what he has now in 2100. Instead of slightly over 9 times because of global warming. So that just really doesn't seem to be catastrophic to me. But nonetheless, they're demanding that we achieve net zero. To do that, they want, first of all, for us to stop using fossil fuels. Well, roughly half the people in the world depend for their daily food on food grown using nitrous fertilizer, which is made from natural gas. That's a fossil fuel. So if you stop using that, you'll have 4 billion people, roughly, starve in a very short time. Now, the remaining roughly 4 billion people in the world depend hugely on fossil fuels for energy, and they depend on concrete and all sorts of other things, the making of which produce CO2 emissions. And the result there would be about 50% of them would die within a number of years for lack of those resources. So in other words, achieving net zero would cost us something in the neighborhood of 6 billion premature deaths. I'm not sure that's such a great idea.
I'm with you on that one, Cal. So approximately what percentage of our atmosphere is made up of carbon dioxide?
Oh, that's a great question. A lot of people will say, oh my goodness, it's a lot, isn't it? Right? Well, No. It is approximately 0.42%. I'm sorry. It's pardon me here. It's 420 parts per million, which figures out to about 42 thousandths of 1%. So that's 0.042%.
It doesn't seem very big.
That's very, very little. Water vapor is far and away the most dominant greenhouse gas. A greenhouse gas is one that absorbs heat moving out from Earth's surface towards space and sends some of it back down toward the surface, making the Earth livable, right? Water vapor and clouds together, and clouds, of course, being condensed water vapor, water vapor and clouds together account for about 95% of Earth's entire greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide accounts for perhaps 4.5%, but about 90% of the carbon dioxide is stuff that is natural anyway, not human emitted. And so CO2 is definitely not a big problem as far as temperature is concerned, but it's a wonderful thing as far as food growth is concerned. All plants need CO2 to do photosynthesis. The more of it they get, the more they grow. NASA itself estimates that the CO2 we've added to the atmosphere since 1960 has caused global leaf area indexed. That is the amount of the surface of the earth that's covered by leaves, by plants, right? Global leaf area index has risen since 1960 solely due to carbon dioxide that we've added to the atmosphere by the equivalent of all the vegetation in the continental United States. That's fantastic. And it includes greater yield from crops all over the world, which means that food is more abundant and more affordable for everybody. And of course, the people who benefit the most from that are the world's poor.
That is interesting point. I want to go back to the carbon dioxide. If it this number you gave of 0.04% of our atmosphere, if that's the case, that's how much carbon dioxide makes up our atmosphere. How responsible is man in that small, tiny percentage? What contribution does man make to that?
Well, percentage? It's very difficult to be precise about that because there are all sorts of confounding factors in trying to measure. Let's assume for a moment, though, that human activity has made all the difference between CO2's concentration pre-industrial revolution, so figure back to about 1750, and today, all right? Well, before the Industrial Revolution, CO2 constituted about 28 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere. Today, it's about 42 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere. So what that means is that we've added about 50% to what it previously was. Now, that 50% still, though we've raised it by 50%, still leaves it at just 42 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere. And so I, as a Christian, reading Genesis 1, which says that when God had made everything, he saw that it was very good. And the everything that he had made includes the climate system, the world's climate system. When I think to myself, all right, would increasing CO2 from 28 thousandths of 1% to 42 thousandths of 1% cause catastrophic results for the world's climate system, making an existential threat to human survival? That just doesn't fit well with a biblical understanding that an infinitely wise God designed, an infinitely powerful God created, and an infinitely faithful God sustains the earth and its climate system. It's kind of like thinking, all right, an architect designs a building so that all of the feedback mechanisms in it will multiply the strain if I lean against a wall over and over again until the whole building collapses. Do I think that architect is brilliant, or do I think he was a fool? Well, I think he was a fool. Well, if the climate system is as fragile as what the climate alarmists think, then the one who designed it is not very wise. Well, as a Christian, I think God is wise, and I think he made the climate system to be robust, resilient, and self-correcting. And that's exactly what we find as we watch the way it works.
Cal, is the climate change agenda connected to taxation and control?
Well, yes. We're watching right now the increasing addition of climate concerns to federal spending, and of course, federal spending requires taxation, either the obvious kind of taxation through income tax and corporate income tax, right, or the sneaky form of taxation, which is through inflation, right? Through deficit spending, which results in government having to sell bonds, increasing the money supply, which then reduces the value, the purchasing value of every dollar out there. Inflation is just taxation in a very sneaky way. So as our federal government spends hundreds of billions of dollars trying to fight climate change for no good results, that is itself a form of taxation. Yeah. And then besides that, what we're seeing, for example, is billions and billions of dollars being spent to subsidize wind and solar energy systems, which are intermittent, unreliable. They're much more expensive to produce electricity from those than coal or natural gas or nuclear. And as a result, our energy prices rise. And since energy is used in all of production and all of transportation, that means the prices of all the goods and services that we consume rise as well. So, we're getting taxed one way or another, either directly or indirectly, either honestly or sneakily.
Dr. Cal Beisner is my guest. He is the president and founder of the Cornwall Alliance. You can learn more about him at cornwallalliance.org. We're going to take a little break, but if you have a question or comment, let me know. 877-933-2484.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Drive time, drive time. Let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
Welcome to the show. If you just joined us, we're talking to Dr. Cal Beisner. We're chatting about climate change, which I've always found to be a little bit of an interesting topic. But what I really like is Cal and all his brilliant scholar friends that hang out at the Cornwall Alliance. You can learn more about that at cornwallalliance.org. You always got a nice promotion for us, Cal. What do you have this time?
Well, actually, what I would recommend at this point is, as our way of saying thank you when someone makes a donation, 100% tax deductible of any amount to the Cornwall Alliance and asks for it, we'll be glad to send them a copy of our book, Climate and Energy: The Case for Realism. This is it's a fat book. It's 464 pages long. It is written by top scientists, economists, energy experts, and yours truly, but I don't compare with those guys. It's written by them, but it's written for ordinary folks. And in fact, every chapter starts out with roughly 2-page long summary that makes it graspable by folks who are not scientists or not economists. What this book does really is show that while, yes, human-induced global warming or climate change is real, it is not catastrophic. And instead, the benefits probably will outweigh the costs, and the cost-benefit ratio of adapting to whatever future climate we face is a lot better than the cost ratio of trying to mitigate that climate change. That is, trying to control global temperature by substituting wind and solar and other renewable energy sources for the fossil fuels, whose abundance and affordability and reliability have lifted much of mankind out of poverty and replaced short lifespans over the past 2 centuries with long lifespans. So if we choose adaptation instead of mitigation, life after climate change, frankly, is going to be better than it is today or ever has been. But if we try to choose mitigation, if we try to slow, stop, or reverse global warming, we will impoverish people all over the world. We will slow, stop, or reverse the conquest of poverty in developing countries. And frankly, Bill, poverty is a much greater risk to any human well-being than anything related to weather and climate. So our way of saying thank you during the rest of the month of October here to your listeners, especially if they will mention that they heard me on your program, and go to cornwallalliance.org/donate and make a donation of any size. We'll send them a copy of Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism. The book retails at $29.99, but we'll accept a gift of any size.
Nice.
And that's just our way of saying thank you.
Well, you're a good guy, Cal. I appreciate that. All right, I want to go back.
Well, we need to get the word out. We need to educate people because, frankly, as we started off on the program talking about the way the media get it, you won't get the truth there. So you can get it from this book.
Mm-hmm. Cal, I'm very interested in knowing, as Christians and followers of Christ, we don't want our brothers and sisters around the world in developing countries to be without energy and to starve and to not have what they need. How do we responsibly and prayerfully go about this whole issue as people sitting in America right now?
Well, frankly, a very important thing that we can do is to be politically active ourselves, to support policies that are friendly to fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are the best source that we have aside from nuclear. So I'd say be friendly to nuclear as well, of affordable, abundant, reliable energy, which is indispensable to lifting and keeping any whole society out of poverty. So we need to support those candidates for political office who will favor fossil fuels over wind and solar, and who will get us to stop the whole climate change bandwagon of trying to control the Earth's temperature. And I'll just give you a simple fact here. President Obama put us into the Paris Agreement for fighting climate change. President Trump took us out of the Paris Agreement. President Biden put us back into the Paris Agreement. And Vice President Kamala Harris, candidate for president this time around, promises to keep us in the Paris Agreement. So with those facts, you can draw your own conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Question came in, Cal, is the world mandating the most expensive energy, solar and wind, on the poorest countries of the world?
Well, yeah, that's happening an awful lot. In fact, the very last chapter of our book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism, is by Vijay Jayaraj. He is an Indian climate scientist, a dear friend of mine, wonderful Christian fellow. And his chapter of the book is all about how the climate and energy policy developed in wealthy Western nations is depriving poor nations around the world of the abundant, affordable, reliable energy that they need to overcome their poverty. So that's something that your listeners can avail themselves of. Yeah, in fact, Vijay calls this whole thing climate colonialism. Uh, we have an awful lot of people in the progressive movement who are very upset about colonialism, but they don't seem to be very upset about the fact that the climate policies pushed by wealthy Western environmentalists are trapping billions of people in poverty by making it so that they cannot take advantage of the abundant, affordable, reliable energy sources that we used to rise up out of poverty. And we're trying to force them to use the much more expensive, unreliable, and not abundant energy from wind and solar. The defenders of wind and solar will say, well, there's abundant energy out there. Solar is huge. The amount of energy coming into the earth every year, every day from the sun is just enormous. Well, that's true. The question is not how much is there. The question is how much does it cost to to transform that from the extremely low density form in which it comes into the Earth's atmosphere to the extremely high density form that we need in electricity. And the answer is, well, it costs a whole lot more than it does to take the extremely high density energy in coal and natural gas and petroleum and transform that into the also extremely high energy, high density energy that we need in electricity or in the fuels for our vehicles.
All right. I didn't know how expensive that was, but I'm not surprised. It seems that every initiative when it comes to renewable energy companies, they don't seem to be a good investment, do they, Cal?
No, they don't. And again, we've got a couple of different chapters by economists in our book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism, that specifically address the costs of wind and solar energy versus energy from fossil fuels or from nuclear. And here's something that your listeners really need to keep in mind, Bill. The defenders of wind and solar will refer to something called levelized cost of electricity. And they'll show that, by golly, in some circumstances, getting electricity from wind and solar can be cheaper per megawatt hour than getting it from natural gas or coal. What they're not telling you is that this measure, levelized cost of electricity, right? That measure does not include all the costs of keeping backup generating stations that use coal or natural gas or nuclear running all the time so that they can take over when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing.
Interesting.
They're also not telling you that so-called levelized cost of electricity does not include the subsidies and the tax write-offs that go especially to the wind and solar industries, rather. And so, for example, per megawatt hour of electricity generated, solar gets on the order of 500 times as much in the way of subsidies and tax preferences, tax write-offs, as do coal or oil or natural gas or nuclear. And wind gets, if I remember correctly, it's about 30 times as much. So if you then reflect those costs, if you add those to the so-called levelized cost of electricity, if you add the subsidies, if you add the tax write-offs, and if you add the cost of running the backup plants for when it's not sunny and it's not windy, then it turns out that wind and solar are far more expensive. But of course, the advocates of them don't really want that news getting out there.
Yeah, it's kind of slightly inconvenient little piece of information, isn't it?
Yeah, one might call it an inconvenient truth.
Yeah, I think I've heard that before somewhere as well. All right, Dr. Cal Beisner is my guest. We're going to take a break and come right back. If you have a question about the climate or any of the issues surrounding it, you can certainly text your question over 877-933-2484. Be right back.
It is my deepest desire that you take the very first step of faith by placing your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. If you've got questions about what it means to begin a relationship with Jesus, text the word faith to 41224.
I'm the Dr. Cal Beisner, president and founder of the Cornwall Alliance. You can learn more about him at thecornwallalliance.org. All right, Cal, here's a question, a couple that came in. Wouldn't USA reducing consumption of fossil fuels make it cheaper for developing countries?
Well, you might think that, but actually, fossil fuels are a globally traded commodity, or three different commodities, coal, oil, and natural gas. And the United States is the world's leading producer of petroleum and natural gas, far and away. And it could be the world's leading producer of coal if our public policies were not preventing that. And so actually, the more we produce, the lower the world price is going to be. But then besides that, other countries depend hugely on the United States for income from trade. But if we reduce our use of fossil fuels and try to replace them with wind and solar, we're going to be putting more and more of our purchasing into wind and solar, and that leaves us less and less to spend on imports of food, clothing, vehicles, whatever, from other countries around the world. And that means then that they don't benefit from that trade. So no, as a matter of fact, the United States keeping a very strong, healthy economy, part of the necessity for, or part of the condition of which is having abundant, affordable, reliable energy. The United States keeping a strong, healthy economy is good for every nation around the world. And frankly, that's true of every nation too. Every nation's good, strong, healthy economy is good for every other nation, which is why you don't want to adopt policies that are harmful to any nation's economy if what you're looking for is to see all of the world rise and stay out of poverty.
Mm-hmm. Cal, I think I heard that 2024 was going to be one of the hottest years ever recorded. How did we come out in 2024?
Well, of course, we have a bit of October and 2 more months to go. Yeah, it looks
Isn't
like
that funny? I'm talking like a Minnesota guy because it's going to be winter here pretty soon. So as far as I'm concerned, the nice weather, the hot weather's over.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, we do have a little bit to go, but I'm quite confident that as far as the most reliable method we have of coming up with so-called global average temperature, and there are some reasons why that idea in very concept is problematic, but we'll leave that aside. The most reliable method we have is by satellite monitoring of global temperature. It's the only way that we get 24/7, 365, all latitudes, all longitudes, all altitudes measuring of the temperature of Earth's atmosphere. And the manager of NASA's version of that, which is the most accurate of them all, is a Cornwall Alliance board member and senior fellow, Dr. Roy W. Spencer of the University of Alabama at Huntsville. And their measurements show that, yes, 2024, if it's not the warmest, choose that word instead of hottest, because the differences we're talking about here are measured in tenths of a degree Celsius, or even hundredths of a degree Celsius. So, to say hottest, that sounds like, man, it's going to make you sweat. No, it's a difference in temperature that you would not notice. anyway, probably 2024 will be either the warmest or one of the 2 or 3 warmest that we've been able to measure with satellites, which goes back to 1979. But again, the difference is so tiny that it's not worth talking about. In fact, let me just make reference to a graph that I'll bet an awful lot of your listeners have seen. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration back in 2018 presented a graph of the anomaly in global average temperature from the 20th century average, running from about 1870, I think it was, to 2018. And for the cooler periods prior, below the average, right, they used blue bars. For the hotter period, they used red bars. The thing looks scary as all get out, and that's intentional, by the way. What they don't really call attention to is the fact that, first of all, if you stop messing with the blue and red bars and you just go to all gray, most of the fear content disappears because the colors aren't there. But second, although if you look closely, you can notice that the entire span of temperatures from the coldest to the hottest, right, is 1.6 degrees Celsius, right? I mean, such that you wouldn't notice it if you walked from a room at the bottom end to a room with the upper end, right? That's the way the graph is. And that graph has been reproduced hundreds of times all over the web and in print sources. And that makes people frightened. Now, what's really cool is to take those same numbers and graph them where the vertical axis is not 1.6 degrees Celsius, but 18 degrees Celsius. And why that? Because that's a pretty typical difference between nighttime low and daytime high in most places around the world.
Yeah.
If you do that, you can barely see the change in the graph. You can see it, you can tell, but it's not frightening. And this is part of how the climate alarmist movement scares people. It uses illustrations that are designed to look frightening, and it doesn't tell people that what we're talking about is measurements that are so tiny that we can't feel them.
All right, Cal, I've got only a minute left. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll probably have to wrap things up. And the question is, I've read where both wind turbine blades and solar panels contain much toxic chemicals. From what I've seen, once they're at the end of their lifespan, they are put in landfills. Isn't this putting future forever chemicals in the ground?
Well, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Very simply.
All right.
Yeah, we haven't figured out economically cost-effective ways yet of recycling the toxic chemicals in both the wind turbine blades and the solar panels. And, I'm all in favor of trying to figure that out. The question is, how much do we want to spend on it? And if we spend that there, we can't spend it somewhere else. So we all have to be thinking like economists, thinking in terms of what are the trade-offs here? If we spend A over here, we can't spend it over there. Yeah. Okay.
Always interesting, and I always appreciate when you make time to come on the show. Cal, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your evening.
Well, thank you, Bill, and I always appreciate it when you have me on. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Dr. Cal Beisner has been my guest. The CornwallAlliance.org is where you can learn more about him and his brilliant colleagues. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our study in 2 Timothy with Bible teacher Jeff Verdorn. Be right back.
Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.